Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic, and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders, and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, and welcome to Bespoken Bones, ancestors at the crossroads of sex, magic, and science. We're in the business of healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. And I'm your host, Pavini Moray. Want to just give a shout out to the folks who have been reaching out, especially this week to Layla. Thanks for the engagement. Thanks for letting me know how the podcast is landing for you. It's meaningful, and it lets me know that I'm moving in good ways, and that's what I want to be doing. So really reach out, tell me what your suggestions are, your questions, just be in touch. And it's great to hear from you. And also just wanting to announce that Taya Shear and I are going to be offering an ancestral lineage healing intensive in Berkeley, California. And that's happening November 30th through December 2nd. And it's 3 full days of workshop of ritual transgenerational healing, walking you through the ancestral medicine process that Dr. Daniel Ford lays out in his book, Ancestral Medicine, Rituals for Personal and Family Healing. So you can expect to engage in connection with your lineage ancestors, heart-centered ritual, prayer, song, visioning, group dialogue. Super good for folks who have a rough time with family. This was me when I started ancestor work, like, ooh, ancestors, yeah. And this process was really helpful in finding like the right place and good relationship with the well and bright ancestors. The training is definitely trauma aware, multicultural, non-dogmatic, and you can register and get more info on my website, which is trancestralhealing.com. So that's it for the plug. I'm super excited today about the interview, introducing you to Anthony Easton. And Anthony is a writer and an artist from Edmonton, now living in Hamilton. And they've shown visual work in New York, Chicago, Hamilton, Toronto, and is in the collection of the library at the National Gallery of Canada. Whoa. And they've written for Maclean's, Pitchfork, Spin, The Atlantic, The Walrus, and a number of other publications, which is how I came across Anthony's work through reading their piece called Transdeath, Exploring Deadnaming Through a Death-Positive Lens. And that was published this summer on the Talk Death blog. So super excited to welcome you, Anthony. Hi.
Hi, how's it going?
Great. So nice to have you. I think we're just going to dive in and talk about the role of naming, like what, especially in trans community, what do you see as the importance of naming?
Well, I think naming has an ability to, as sort of an act of radical creation, and I think that naming is always sort of this ambivalent thing. So we name when we have, I think that we name when we have any kind of new transition. We change names when we're born, we change names when we're married, we change names when we move through gender, we change names often at a sort of a moment of extreme sort of switch of personhood. And so I think that how we name becomes a sort of metonymy of who we are or who we wish to be.
Yeah, it's super good. First of all, I just want to say I love the phrase move through gender. Like, it's so great because I think it is, it's an arc through our lifetime, and we're not, if we use gender as a verb, we're not gendering in the same way. At least I would imagine that most of us are not gendering in the same way that we did when we were 6 or that we did when we were 16, or, that there is this like arc of it. And I think you're really speaking to the way you said naming is an act of creation, right? It's an act of agency. And I just wanting to name that, like, I have a kid who just transitioned into high school and renamed themselves as in that transition, right? And like, yeah, just that act of like, how do I step into the power that is when I claim that and claim that as mine? Yeah, that's really great. So we're going to talk about deadnaming, which is something that comes up especially in trans community. And I just, I'm hoping you'll give a little bit of explanation of like what it is, how it's used, just some background around that whole practice.
Sure. I don't want to claim any authority that I don't have. And I wanted to put that out first. But I think that sort of dead naming becomes this space where people, it's often used hostilely, it's often used as an act of oppression, it's often used very explicitly against somebody. It's not respecting the names or the pronouns or the personhood of who they are. So if they told you that they're going by Judy and you know the name beforehand, or if you disclose the name that they are no longer using, it becomes a sort of act of, as I said, sort of depersoning or an act of sort of violent hostility.
So it's really like when a person who is moving through gender lets you know the name that is their name or the pronoun that is their pronoun, and one makes a choice to, I guess it's a choice. I mean, I would say that like sometimes we just slip up, like we're trying to, like I'm, trying to learn my kid's new name and sometimes I'm slipping up.
You can tell when something's hostile and you can tell when something is benign. And so I think that dead naming is hostile. I think if you fuck up and don't make a big deal about it and immediately amend and work towards it, towards a reconciling spirit, that's different than using naming as a kind of active hostile gesture.
Yeah. Do you because it's interesting, this term dead naming, right? Because it's like, it's almost like, well, maybe you could just speak to like, I don't know if you know, not necessarily the origins of the term, but why is it called dead naming?
Well, it's because of who you're burying your past, right? It's who you were no longer. You're this new person. You're sort of transness becomes a sort of birth of a new self. And so the old self is dead, is no longer extant.
And so you have talked about in your writing how dead naming is used as an act of hostility. Can you just give some examples about that?
Sure. I think we can go from the sort of most obvious examples to the least to the sort of most egregious examples. And I think the examples where people refuse to believe the transgendered people, and so they won't use the name that the trans people have chosen because they refuse to acknowledge their trans existence. And I think that's part of dead naming. I think that there's trans exclusionary radical feminists who believe deeply wrongly that the choosing women's name is an act of sort of cultural appropriation, and so they'll refuse to give names, refusing to acknowledge sort of sisterhood of trans women. I think there's also that people have died in chosen outside of their chosen trans communities and then been buried, and then not having those chosen communities been told for months or years afterwards. I think that there are people who have died and had their families not had their names wrong or their genders wrong on tombstones, or been in the wrong clothing at funerals. And so I think there's a very explicit sort of connection, as I said previously, between those forms of selfhood, like between the naming and the refusing to name and those rituals.
Yeah, it's like if you're refusing to acknowledge the name someone tells you, it's like basically saying you don't exist, your existence isn't valid. Like you don't even have the personhood that I have. Like I get to decide if you're a person or not, basically. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I just want to take a minute, and especially for folks who might be listening and have never heard of this practice of dead naming. I mean, I think, there's lots of us who get it, but can you imagine someone really just saying, that's not your name? Like you tell them your name and they're like, that's not your name.
Yeah.
It's, I had this remembering of, once when I was right after college, I went to a bar and I handed them my ID, and it was my legit ID, and they took it and they're like, this is fake. And they wouldn't give it back. And I was traveling at the time, and I had to get my driver's license back, and going to them and being like, well, you can call the police. Like, this is my actual ID. But just that the shock of, you're telling me that my ID isn't valid, and it's even more personal. Like, they weren't telling me my name wasn't valid. They weren't telling me my gender identity wasn't valid. They're just saying this is a fake ID. But yeah, it's so, I think if you haven't had that experience, you probably just can't get it.
No, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned, I think that Brandon Tina is a really great example to bring in because you mentioned that in the article.
Yeah, that his name and his identity as a sort of brother or as a person is not on the tombstone. I think it says beloved sister and friend. If that hasn't been changed recently.
Wow. Yeah, that's so intense. And so it's like, so if a trans person dies, and then it's hard to imagine the sense of like ownership that you can have over the body of someone else, like when they're dead, it's like, oh my God, it's just horrifying to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the trans exclusionary radical feminist thing, since it's so up right now with the trans community. And do you want to give a little bit of background, or should I give a little bit of background about that?
Well, I mean, it's in a way not my fight. I think it's really insanely difficult because I grew up in this sort of second wave feminist house, and I grew up with shelves bursting with like Jermaine Greer, and it was such an important part to my sort of radicality. And then to have these sort of second wave feminist women who are my icons say would continually that gender is not a process, or gender is not liquid, or that gender is not is continually reinforcing this sort of binary, that they continue thinking that people who find themselves to be women are continually delegitimized, that it's impossibility. They have this sort of weird reinforcement of a biological imperative that they thought they had gotten over, or a refusal to understand that biology itself can be incredibly complex and difficult, that nothing is stable. And so I don't understand this sort of trans-exclusionary radical feminists' obsession with sort of the stability of a gender when they have spent so much time trying to push that away.
Yeah, it's super weird.
I genuinely don't get it. I don't get it.
I don't get it either. I'm like, I think we're all on the same page here. I think we're all fighting for liberation, from hegemony. And like, here we are in the situation where a certain group of women is telling another group of women, you're not women. It's so strange.
Yeah.
It's so strange to me. And you're saying that the dead naming is part of that, right?
Yeah, that there are Janice Raymond refuses to acknowledge people's names, that she uses old names even when she has been told repeatedly about new names.
Mm-hmm. So like deliberately,
as an act of,
like, I will not acknowledge. Yeah, I'm making a conscious stance to not acknowledge it. Yeah. Whew. I'm pretty interested in, obviously my work is around ancestors and like proto ancestors or elders. And so I'm super interested in having awesome elders. And it's really, I don't know how it is for you, but it's like painful for me when like the people who I look up to and the people who I'm thinking are like super like radical, and like the people who have built the movement that my movement is growing on are jerks, basically.
Yeah. Well, it's also like, you always have to be careful that you're not that kid, right? You always have to be careful that you're not that person. And so you see, like, you just have this anxiety in the back of your head, or I have this anxiety in the back of my head that I'm going to be in 10 years or 15 years, just not understanding what people were like,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it happened to me recently. I was organizing with some younger folks, and they were like, oh, actually the internet is so, because I was kind of like railing against social media like I do sometimes, and they were talking about like, no, actually the internet is like, for us, it's been the place of transition, right? Like it's been the place of getting support. And I was just like, oh my God, I don't want to be that older person who's like, the internet, So totally like a call to my attention of like, oh yeah, I've got to keep up. I've got to be awesome, like, and continuing to like check in and check myself. Yeah. Do you have any hope for the situation with radical lesbian elder feminists shifting to be more trans?
I don't know. And I want to be really careful too, because it's like, I'm not presented as masculine, I don't identify as masculine, but I present as masculine. So you want to make sure that you're not resting on male patriarchy and privilege, and you want to make sure you hear what they're saying, and you want to make sure they know what you're listening to, and you want to make sure that their spaces are not being absorbed. So you want to respect that while still making sure that your trans siblings aren't actively being destroyed by them.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to construct that balance.
Yeah.
I don't know how to.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Totally. I feel you. I'm in the same place. Like, how do I honor those who came before me and their work, and kind of like gently insist, hey, yo, over here. Like, we got to go this way now. Right. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Would you speak a little bit about the good death movement and that, and how you see that as important?
Yeah. Well, I think that, like, I'm thinking about the good death movement, and I think it's part of what the article was about, and its relationship to what it means to dead name. And I think that we think of death as this ultimate binary, right? Like, you're alive and then you're dead.
Right.
And I think that this idea of ancestry, like, and there's this academic called Carolyn Dinshaw who has this idea of queer time as continually circling and cycling and continually not arriving on this sort of linearity and refusing this linearity. And I think if we think about sort of good death as a way of analyzing and pulling away from the sort of medicalized, hermetic, sealed, binary enforcing life taking situation, and we think about transness as a series of transitions or processes or constructions, then we can think of the possibility of dead naming, acknowledging that yourself is continually a set of names, a continually a set of relationships. So it's cyclical. It never quite ends right. It sort of returns back to itself and goes forward, and returns back to itself and goes forward. Just as, like, we are interiorly everything that we are sort of the children of our ancestors, as you were talking about, right? Like, I don't know if that makes sense.
It totally makes sense. Yeah, I'm grokking it in, like, the way that I hold ancestors and descendants, right? That I am a part of a stream of time, if you will.
Yeah.
And you're saying that, like, that might be the macro, and then on the micro level, there's a stream of time that is holding each of us, and there's a continuum of naming, that we're a collection of all of our previous and future identities, names, selves, right?
Yeah.
Is that kind of, am I getting queer time?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. Yeah.
What do you think, like, what are the implications of that? If I hold that my life is like this good death thing, that it's cyclical, that, like, life and death and life and death and life and death, and that's spiraling and queer time and all of the holding of all of these different pieces, like, what becomes possible?
Well, I think that it allows for the potential, and we're not there yet, because I think there's so much hostility and so much violence and against.
Totally.
And so we have to be really careful about sort of maintaining boundaries right now, just for our safety. But I think this is sort of radical utopic potential of our queer selves being continually renewing. I just recently sort of, I don't know, in the last 3 or 4 years, just sort of acknowledged publicly and changed my pronouns and became non-binary. I became genderqueer. And I think that in that position was a recognition that I could live in this both, and that I didn't have to sort of construct my reality as explicitly or as tightly, and have this looseness and have this sort of liberation potential, that kind of flow. And I think that that's what's different for me. It's acknowledging that I don't know, or acknowledging that things can come and go, acknowledge that sort of the body can be centered, the body can float away, and that sort of continual negotiation of the body doesn't have to be sort of contained within the language that we have previously had for it.
Yeah, I love that, because I hear a couple of things that I want to just punctuate here. One is, it's like the external policy versus the in-house policy, right? And like,
Yeah.
like externally, like you don't get to decide if I'm a collection of my names, whoever you are, but like internally, I get to decide how I am with that continuum of time that exists through all my identities in this particular body, right?
Yeah.
And maybe beyond this particular body, but like for sure in this particular body. And the potential that happens when we allow, it's almost like integration is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
allow all of the parts of us to be a part of us. There's a possibility, a potential for our wholeness that is radically outside the binary, that is kind of, you can see in like life, death, girl, boy, like all that binary,
Yeah.
like we're outside the binary and we get to be whole in whole time and have all of the experiences that we have, and they don't have to be so discrete, differentiated, separate, compartmentalized. They're just like, I am a whole being, and I am a fluid. There's a fluidness, a fluidity to living through this body.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And as a Christian, I think as well, there's this Christian idea of a community of saints that is always looking in, and that one is always part of also the body of Christ. And so one's body is always sort of unmoored in religious experience as it is. And so I think that there's this trans potential as well in being part of that community of saints, or being part of that body of Christ, and having that body of Christ be both immaterial and material.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that you're using the you're looking through the Christian lens, but it's more transpersonal.
Yeah,
you're talking about like I am part of a body of spirit. I am part of a body of divinity.
Yeah,
whatever I call that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Totally. And when I talk about it, and I love the communion of saints, and I've definitely had guests on the show talking about it. It's like, what would it, I'm just having this like really cool, beautiful mental picture of like, what would a communion of transcestors be like? Can you imagine?
Yeah. Well, and you end up picking that up. Like, there's this amazing collection of bearded female saints in the 12th and 13th centuries. And you're like, that's one of mine. Wilger Fortis is one of mine. She's mine.
Yeah, like I'm just going to go back and collect them all and have a big transistor dinner party, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God, can you imagine the fabulous glitter everywhere? It would be great. Yeah, and I think that beyond that like sense of there are these beings through time who have had these genderliminal experiences, and where sexuality has been, such a way of connecting with spirit. There's a when I lean into the transcestors, I don't know how it is for you, but like when I lean into these concepts, it's like, oh, I belong. Like I am in a lineage of belonging. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything about that?
No, I think it's always like, but it's always within the edge of not, because you always have to create a narrative against the dominant narrative. So you belong, but you belong to this sort of act of carving or creating your own space, or weaving your own tradition within a tradition that is hostile. So it becomes this kind of like red thread in a black and white tapestry, or it becomes
like a belonging of outsiders.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if how marginalized communities, I think this might be kind of the dead naming thing that you're saying, like, yes, I know I'm ahead of my time in saying this. Yes, we're not there yet. But what I also hear is there's a power, like just like the word fag has been reclaimed, or the word queer has been reclaimed. Like there's a power in holding, in, kind of in our naming of ourselves, and in our our fierceness around like, I get to have any names and all the names. And yeah, am I getting it?
Well, and I think it's this profound intimacy as well, in the sense of like having trans people who have changed their names come to you and say, this is who I was before. Or there's always this sort of taboo for the longest time that it was always considered this completed circle, that, I once was a man and now I'm a woman, and to have people say, like, that's not necessarily the circle that is completed, or for those people whose circle is completed in that capacity, have them say, this is who I was before. And I've had trans friends of mine who who are FTMs and MTFs who pulled me aside and shown me personal archives or personal selfhoods and not showing them to the world. And so there is that kind of ritual, of intimate ritual that is exclusively queer that doesn't exist in public as well. And I think it's important to honor that kind of ancestry.
Ah, yes, the ancestors that we have been to ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like my partner is trans and I'm trans, and in our cabinet where we have all of our special things, there are pictures of both of us at various iterations in our lives in, lots of different gender and fashion iterations. Like, why is fashion not as important gender? I don't understand. I think that's a wrong that we're doing to ourselves, right? But that there is that those archives of selfhood. You go to someone and you tell them, this is my active creation, this is my name. And they're like, well, fuck you. I'm going to call you whatever I want because that's too much work for me. And you're like, I don't recognize that or whatever. But like, it's like they're missing the opportunity, right? To like see you and know you and like the gift of that, right?
Yeah, no, 100%.
Yeah. It's like, that's what I would like to talk with these lesbian elders about. Like, sure, you can be all positional and shit, but really, look at what I'm offering. Like, look at what I'm coming with.
It's an open hand versus a closed hand, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Like, here's my name, right?
Yeah.
Anthony, anything that feels important to share about death practices for trans people that you'd like to see in the world?
Well, I think it's just a question of respect, right? And I think that you have to acknowledge that any community the person is a member of. I think that traditions of selfhood, traditions of identity, traditions of their own community, the trans rituals seem new. And so we have to figure out how to work within this historical form while still acknowledging the sort of emergence of a new liturgy. I think liturgy creates bodies and creates self. I think that just like naming people as an act of respect and taking the gift they gave you, that gift has to continue on past death. I don't know what that ritual looks like because it does feel like a new emergent practice.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to consider. I mean, and I'm imagining that this has happened for lots of trans people that have had respectful deaths with their loved ones, like being super awesome and mindful and careful about, as they were in life. And I know that for tons of people, it hasn't happened like that at all. But it's interesting to think about, like, what if there is no body of ritual, right? What do we want for ourselves? What as a community? And granted, it's going to be different for different people and different traditions, sure. But like, what are the like basic tenets of like how to have a good trans death and a good trans death ritual?
I think it's just respect. I think it's just an acknowledgement of, just like any other funeral, an acknowledgement that death is not the end, that death, as one dies in a community, that one dies in a set of social practices, and that one dies, one's memory or one's sort of incorporeal selfhood doesn't necessarily die. And so respect that sort of incorporeal selfhood as well.
Yeah, so I just wanted to give an example of something where I think what the utopic vision that you're sharing is where it's actually happened. And there's a book that I read as part of my dissertation research, which was called Black Bull Ancestors and Me, My Life as a Lesbian Sangoma, by Nkunzi Nakabindi. And I don't know if I'm saying that right. But anyway, he died this year. So he had written this book about his experiences being a lesbian, and then later transitioned. And the way the obituary is written holds both of those things. Holds like that the book was super important, and then this person transitioned. It does not. It uses his right pronouns and his right name throughout the whole thing. And I think it's just an example of like being really careful. It's like maybe we even have to be extra careful when the gender liminal folks crossover in how we hold that space, like maybe more so than for cisgender folks. But yeah, I think that there are examples in the world of how this can go and go well.
Yeah, and I think that's the archive work we have to do on our own, right? Too, is to construct a list of places where it has gone well.
Yeah, because this person had, has images, like it was recent, right? So they're online, so they have like images, and their transition is online, and so like, how do we, like, when we're representing the trans dead, if they indeed represented themselves as moving through gender, how can we help support that and hold this piece of like, we're not going to dead name, we're not going to depronoun or depersonalize. Yeah, cool. Feel really grateful for having you on the show. It's been an honor, and I just want to thank folks for listening to this episode. And if you feel inspired by what you've heard, you can go to my website, which is trancestralhealing.com. You can learn more about the sexual and ancestral wellness work that I offer and be in touch. I am Pavini Moray, and I'll be back every full and new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom.